All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the Gospel of John. In this recording, we are wrapping up the Gospel of John. This will be our final recording on John, and we will be looking at John chapter 21, verses 1 through 25. And in a very real sense, these verses sort of serve like a bookend or an epilogue to the Gospel of John. John had built his story to that culminating moment in the last section where Thomas really confesses that Jesus is his Lord and his God. That's sort of like the high moment in the gospel. John then states his whole purpose for writing is he wants everyone to have that same experience, be able to respond to Jesus the way Thomas did as well, not because they've seen him, but because they've believed in the testimony of others. Even though they haven't seen, they still believe. Well, after that high moment, and after that statement of his purpose, we get this snapshot that happens sometime after the resurrection. We're not really even sure when. And it's like an epilogue to the gospel. Not that it's unimportant. It tells us something very important, but it's sort of like bonus material here at the end. And so it reads like this. After these things, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. So John's going to tell another story where Jesus showed himself, appeared after his resurrection. And we don't know exactly when this is. We know from Luke's telling of the story of Jesus in Acts chapter 1 that Jesus appeared for about 40 days from his first resurrection appearance till he ascended into heaven. There was about 40 days. So sometime in that 40 days, this occurred. And notice where it occurred. At the Sea of Tiberias, that is the Sea of Galilee. So the previous two records of Jesus' appearance were right there in Jerusalem around Passover time period. Now we're up north. And for whatever reason, the disciples have traveled back to the north and they're around the Sea of Galilee. And here's what happens. Verse 2, Simon Peter, Thomas, who was called Didymus, he's there on this occasion, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, that would be James and John himself, and two other disciples were all together. So you got Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, James and John, and then two more. So you got a good chunk of the 12 disciples. They're all together in Galilee. And Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. They said to him, we're coming with you. So they went out, got into the boat, and they fished over the course of the night, and they caught nothing. But then, early in the morning, notice verse 4, when the day was now breaking, so it's just now sunup, Jesus stood on the beach. He stands somewhere on the shore, yet the disciples didn't know that it was Jesus. They didn't recognize him. He's a little ways away. The light is a little off. It's hard to see him. And so Jesus said to them, children, you do not have any fish to eat, do you? They assume it's just someone on the beach wondering if they could share a fish that he could have for breakfast, and they answered, no. And he said to them, cast the net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you will find some fish. Now, Jesus had done something exactly like this early on in his time with him. You can actually read that account in Luke chapter 5, verse 1 and following. So they follow his instructions, and they cast it. And they were not able to haul it in because of the great quantity of fish. So their cast net captures so many fish. It's so heavy, they can't even get it into the boat. Therefore, the disciple whom Jesus loved, that is, one of the sons of Zebedee, that is John himself, the author of this gospel, said to Peter, it's the Lord. He had done something like this earlier. Now it happens again. All of a sudden, that switches on a memory. And John says to Peter, it's Jesus again. And so when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and he threw himself into the sea. This is a little bit of an awkward moment, and we probably need to think through how to picture this scene a little bit, because the wording is a little tricky. When it says Peter was stripped for work, literally that says Peter was naked. But he couldn't have been working completely naked because the Jews didn't do that. They just wouldn't do that. That was completely contrary to Jewish propriety. So he couldn't be totally naked. Not only that, also putting on like a heavy outer garment over yourself before jumping into the water. Well, that's a bit odd too. So what exactly should we picture here? And scholars have wrestled with that, and there really are two good options. One option is this. Peter was working with just like a loincloth on or an under shirt type tunic on or something like that, and felt like greeting the Lord in that kind of attire wouldn't be appropriate. So he donned his cloak and then jumped into the sea, even though it made it difficult for him to swim. That is one option. Or the second option is he was working with his cloak on, or maybe a worker's smock on, and had nothing on underneath on this occasion for whatever reason. So the he was naked actually explains why he kept his outer garment on. And that actually makes sense of the verb translated put on, which actually means tied up, gird up, not actually put on. And so probably the way to picture it is Peter's out there working in some sort of robe and he has nothing on underneath. And so when he hears it's the Lord, well, he can't get naked, so he actually ties up his robe to make it easier to swim, jumps into the sea, and swims to shore in his excitement to see Jesus. But, verse 8, the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land, about 200 cubits away, and they came dragging this net full of fish behind them in the boat. 200 cubits is about 150 yards. So they're about 150 yards offshore as they come dragging this net in. And when they got on land, they already saw a charcoal fire made and fish placed on it and bread. So here's Jesus on the shore. He's got a campfire made and he's already got some fish and bread warming by the fire, cooking on the fire. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you've now caught." So Simon Peter went up, helped haul in the net to land, full of large fish, 153 of them. And even though there were so many, the net wasn't torn. I don't think we need to go into any wild speculations of the significance of 153 fish or anything like that. John, as a fisherman who's writing this, adds this detail, and it just makes sense that it would stick in his memory because he's a fisherman himself. This is like a massive haul of fish, and as incredible as it is, the net didn't break. And John was just, as a fisherman, like, that's amazing. This was an incredible moment that just stood out in his mind. So they haul these fish up onto shore. They grab some of the fresh fish out of there, clean those fish, and they cook those on the fire. And Jesus says to them, "Come, have breakfast." And none of the disciples ventured to inquire of him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Even though the resurrection is so surprising, even though this haul of fish is so incredible, even though Jesus is coming and going at random like this, they know it's the Lord. And they're not going to ask him, "Who are you and what's going on?" They know it's him. It's just so shocking and surprising to them. And Jesus came and he took the bread and he gave it to them. And the fish, he gave it to them as well. And he passed out the food to them. And then John tells us this was now the third time that Jesus revealed himself to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Probably not the third time in the sense of this is only the third one, because we know there are others from the other Gospels. This is the third time that John has recorded. And then John turns to a little sidebar conversation after breakfast between Jesus and Peter. And that really transitions then into the conclusion to the Gospel. So verse 15, "Now when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?'" So picture the scene. They've had this incredible encounter with Jesus on the beach. They've eaten breakfast with him. To know what that conversation was like as they sat on logs or whatever around this fire and ate this breakfast. And now breakfast is over and Jesus and Peter are together on the beach. Maybe they're strolling along the beach. That's sort of the way the story unfolds, as it appears they're walking along. And Jesus engages Peter in a conversation. It's a conversation which intends to restore Peter to his calling as an apostle and a shepherd on Jesus' behalf. And so he says, "Simon Peter, son of John," that's, now we know his dad's name, right? Bar-John, son of John, "do you love me more than these?" And when he says more than these, that's a little bit unclear. Who or what are these? Grammatically, it could be these things or these people. So it could be, do you love me more than these things? That is more than boats and nets and the sea and fish, right? I mean, Jesus is resurrected and Peter's like, I'm going fishing. So it could be that. Or it could be more than these people. Do you love me more than you love these men here? All these other guys that you just went fishing with and you spent so much time with. Or some have even suggested that it means, do you really love me more than these other men love me? That is, in view of Peter's assertion on the night before Jesus' crucifixion that he would be faithful to the end, even if all the others wouldn't. Are you really sure that's the case, Peter? Right? Jesus is asking Peter maybe to reevaluate himself. The problem is it's just not perfectly clear which one of those it is. I tend to think that in view of Jesus' original call found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke to leave his nets and follow him, and in view of Jesus' clear commissioning to future ministry in this very episode in John 21, it's probably more than likely that first option, more than the nets and the boats and fishing, more than everything Peter has known. Peter, do you love me more than all of this? Peter responds and said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. So Jesus said to him, Tend my lambs. Here is Peter's restoration and commissioning, from fishing to tending Jesus' lambs. This will be the imagery that Jesus uses every time in this conversation with Jesus. So again, verse 16, he said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. So Jesus said to him, Shepherd my sheep, take care of my sheep, tend my lambs, shepherd my sheep. And then once again, he said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Now, Peter was hurt. He was stung a bit because he had said to him the third time, Do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, Tend my sheep. Now, let me just offer a few observations from this interchange between Jesus and Peter. The first is 3 reaffirmations of Peter to match Peter's 3 denials. I think that's significant. I don't think that's accidental. I think Jesus is asking him this 3 times really to match those 3 denials. And maybe that's why it stung so much, because Peter got the message. It brought to mind the pain of that moment. It recalled that moment, just however many nights ago it was when this interchange happened. Peter could recall it. He felt the pang of disappointment and self-disappointment in denying Jesus. And so it wasn't just that he asked him 3 times. It was that he asked him 3 times in view of Peter's denials 3 times. And the other observation is that even though that's the case, even though Peter denied him, Peter's denials don't exclude Peter from serving Jesus. Peter, tend my sheep. Peter, shepherd my sheep. Peter, tend my lambs. That's going to be Peter's job. And Jesus is basically saying, Peter, even though that happened, even though you denied me, I still trust you with my mission and my ministry. A third observation here is Peter uses actually this very same imagery for his work and the work of elders in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1. Again, I think that's significant. And then finally, a final observation here is there any significance to the different words for love that are used in this conversation in the original Greek? Jesus' first 2 questions use the verb agapao. Peter's responses use the verb phileo. Jesus' third question uses the verb phileo. And all of that has led some preachers particularly to suggest that Jesus is calling for a deeper love and finally settles on an inferior love because that's what Peter keeps insisting on. But I just think that way overstates the case. It way overstates the case of the difference between phileo and agapao, those 2 Greek words. I also think it doesn't really do justice to the fact of Peter's own use of phileo. Like, really doesn't make sense to suggest that Peter would be saying, yes, but I love you less than agapao. Like, that's what you would have to be saying. Jesus is saying, do you agapao me? Do you love me with that kind of love? And Peter's like, yes, Lord, you know that I don't agapao you love, but I phileo you love. I mean, if you're going to be consistent with the meaning of phileo, you have to say that, and that just doesn't make sense. So it seems likely to me that these words, phileo and agapao, two different Greek words for love, are actually being used in a similar way, almost overlapping or interchangeably here in this section. And that means I don't think there's a massive difference between them. I think Jesus is asking Peter, do you love me? Peter is saying, I love you with everything I have. And Jesus is basically giving him the opportunity to reaffirm that in view of his 3 denials. Well, Jesus then continues by informing Peter what will happen in the later years as he goes about this ministry and mission, and really how he will die. Look at verse 18. Truly, truly, I tell you, Jesus again speaking to Peter, when you were younger, you used to put on your belt and walk wherever you wanted. In other words, you had the freedom to get dressed when you wanted to get dressed, go wherever you wanted to go. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will put your belt on you and bring you where you do not want to go. In other words, there's going to come a point, Peter, when you're at the mercy of others, when you don't have the freedom to get dressed on your own, you don't have the freedom to go where you want to go, you're going to be led by other people where you don't want to go. And then John explains the underlying significance of these words for us in verse 19. Now he, that is Jesus, said this to Peter, indicating by what kind of death he would glorify God. In other words, John is telling us that in saying this, what Jesus is telling Peter, so there's going to come a day, Peter, when you're going to be at the mercy of others because you're their prisoner. And you are going to be led where you don't want to go, meaning you're going to be led to execution, even though you don't want to go there. And early Christian tradition says that Peter was crucified, and crucified specifically upside down, because he didn't want to die the same way that Jesus did. And all of that then leads to a final call to action. And when he said this, he said to him, follow me. This is Jesus, like, again, reaffirmation, reinstating Peter, follow me in ministry, follow me in mission, follow me in self-sacrifice, follow me. And Peter in that moment turns around and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved, that is John himself, following them. That's why I say they're strolling on the beach, right? They're having this little conversation as they're kind of walking along on the beach, and John is following behind. Peter turns, sees him, and John then clarifies exactly who this is, the one who had leaned back on his chest at the supper and said, Lord, who is the one who is betraying you? In other words, John himself. He's drawing attention to this fact. So Peter sees him, and upon seeing him, said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? In other words, what about John? And Jesus said to him, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. In other words, what Jesus is telling Peter is, don't worry about his fate. Don't worry about his future. That's for him alone. He and I will take care of his future. You worry about yourself. You take responsibility for yourself. You follow me. Therefore, this account, this little story about this moment, this account went out among the brothers and sisters, among the fellow Christians, that disciple wouldn't die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but only, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? In other words, John is clarifying, this is a misunderstanding. Because John's now old. When this moment happened between Peter and Jesus and John was a young guy, but now he's old, and he could die at any time. And he doesn't want anyone to be confused if he dies before Jesus comes. The Lord didn't really say that. That's not what the Lord promised. And then John says this in verse 24. This is the disciple. This disciple who leaned back on Jesus' chest at the supper and asked for clarification on who's betraying him. The disciple who was the one who ran to the tomb and got there before Peter and then eventually went in after Peter. The disciple who was trailing Peter and Jesus on the beach that morning after the resurrection. This is the disciple who is testifying about these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. It's that statement there in verse 24. That statement is the one that tells us that the beloved disciple is John and that he is the author of the gospel. It's also a clear claim to be offering eyewitness testimony. That's what John wants us to know. I'm the one writing these things. I was there. I saw it. I interacted with it. I'm an eyewitness. Now, who is the we when John says, and we know that his testimony is true? Well, it could just be the editorial use of we, but there's also an early tradition that says John wrote his gospel at the urging of fellow church leaders in the city of Ephesus. So if that's the case, if John was encouraged by the elders in the church at Ephesus to write down his gospel, well, then that we could refer to John plus the elders, basically saying, look, this is the story, because there is now beginning to be some false teaching and some false accounts about Jesus. Here's the truth, and we know that his story is true. His gospel is true. Then the final words of the gospel are this: but there are also many other things which Jesus did, which, if they were written in detail, I expect that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. John ended the high moment in the gospel in John 20 by saying, look, there's so many more signs I could have written. I've chosen these ones that you might believe. Now he says, there's so much more I want to say about Jesus, or could be said about Jesus, that even if they were written down, the whole world couldn't contain all the books. In other words, the story of Jesus is bigger and greater than any book can contain. In fact, than all the books in the world can contain. That's how great and incredible Jesus is, and that's how incredible the story of him is. And so, as we wrap up this section and ultimately wrap up the Gospel of John, let me just offer a few reflections here. The first is just this moment that begins this little epilogue to the Gospel of John, and that is breakfast on the beach. How delightfully down to earth this final scene with Jesus is. Here's the resurrected Jesus, the Lord of the universe, the King of all the nations, Jesus, eating breakfast on the beach with his disciples and friends. And as you sit there and listen to this scene and imagine the scenes, you need to picture it. Hear the water lap upon the beach as the waves lightly and gently roll in. Smell the smell of the campfire and the cooking fish. Enter into the excitement of recognition. Peter, Peter, it's the Lord, as Peter then jumps into the water. Jesus is every much as alive before, eating with his friends, talking with his friends around a campfire on the beach. Second reflection is feeding Jesus' sheep. This is the call to mission and ministry. And while the focus here is on Peter, Peter himself actually passes on this very same commission to the church leaders in 1 Peter 5:1 and following, as I noted above. Peter writes these words. He says, therefore, I urge the elders among you, as your fellow elder and as a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and as one who is a fellow partaker of the glory that is to be revealed. And then Peter says, shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God. And he goes on and gives some more instructions there. But notice that, shepherd the flock of God. That's very much the commission that Jesus reinstated and restored Peter to here on the beach. Shepherd my sheep, shepherd the flock of God. And Peter here now is passing it on to church leaders in another time and another place. And thus it seems fair to say that this is the responsibility of those who care for the church still to this day. Tend Jesus' lambs. Feed Jesus' sheep. And so as we wrap up the Gospel of John, may we commit ourselves to following the resurrected Jesus. Follow me, as Jesus said to Peter. May it be true of us. Follow me. May we follow the resurrected Jesus wherever he leads. And may we care for any of his sheep that Jesus sees fit to put in our charge. Follow me and tend my sheep. What a climactic and fitting way to end the Gospel of John. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a crowd-funded, listener-supported Bible teaching ministry that exists only because people just like you give $5 a month, $10 a month, $50 a month, $100 a month, whatever it is. It is the generosity of others that makes this ministry exist, and God is using that generosity to bear good fruit in the lives of others. So thanks a ton for your support and your generosity. Thanks a ton for your heart and your kingdom vision that wants to see the Word of God go forward into the world. And if you have been impacted or blessed by this ministry, could I encourage you to prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters so that God could continue to expand the reach and the impact of this ministry throughout the world in other places, other languages, and other ways, so that the listener's commentary could continue to be used to bear good fruit. The easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button. There will be it'll redirect you to a page, my page at World Family Mission, where you can put in a dollar amount. You can click the box that says Make This Monthly. Then those funds will all come my way to help this ministry continue to grow and increase. Thanks a ton for your support.